You look at your dinner plate today and take your absolute control over nature completely for granted. You see a perfect row of green beans. You see a mound of fluffy white rice. For most of your life you have assumed that someone simply planted a seed on purpose to create this food. How did this cycle of endless abundance actually begin? For about 300,000 years this control did not exist at all. Your ancestors moved continuously across wild landscapes. They tracked the migrating herds of massive beasts. They followed the shifting patterns of the changing seasons with absolute precision. Today, modern humans rely on just a handful of heavily engineered crops for 90% of their daily calories, completely forgetting the ancient struggle that made this possible. But agriculture was never a sudden stroke of genius. It was a slow and brutal accident. What exactly happened before you understood how seeds actually worked? Imagine you are living 20,000 years ago. You do not know what a seed is. You do not understand the invisible mechanics of plant reproduction. You simply know that certain plants grow in certain specific places. You know that when the heavy rains come, the green shoots always follow. You are a master of natural observation. You recognize hundreds of different edible plants just by looking at the subtle shapes of their leaves. Why would you ever try to change this perfectly balanced system? You do not try to change it intentionally. You are simply trying to survive a hostile and shifting world. The global climate is changing rapidly around you. The deep freeze of the last ice age is slowly coming to an end. The world is becoming warmer and significantly wetter, completely altering the landscape you have known since birth. Dense forests are expanding into your ancient hunting grasslands. The massive animals you rely on for meat and bone are suddenly moving further north or disappearing entirely. How do you feed your starving family when the old world vanishes right before your eyes? You have to adapt your strategy. You have to look closer at the ground. You have to find smaller, less obvious sources of energy. This is not a choice you make willingly. This is a desperate reaction to a terrifying reality. The hunting trips take longer and yield much less meat. Your children cry from hunger in the cold night. You begin to notice the wild grasses growing on the hillsides. You never paid much attention to them before. Now they look like a desperate chance at survival. Will these tiny, hard grains be enough to keep your people alive? Let us look at the silent evidence left behind in the ancient dirt. At an archaeological site called Ohelo II in modern Israel, researchers discovered something entirely remarkable. Archaeologist Ehud Weiss and his dedicated team excavated the submerged, waterlogged remains of an ancient human camp. They found tens of thousands of perfectly preserved plant remains buried in the mud. They found undeniable microscopic evidence of wild barley and wild wheat being processed by human hands. The people living here 23,000 years ago were definitely not farmers. They were simply hunter-gatherers gathering wild and highly unpredictable grains from the surrounding hills. What were they doing with all this wild and stubborn grass? They were trying to survive the changing seasons. They were gathering anything they could carry. They were experimenting with new ways to process tough, fibrous foods. You are one of these people. You walk through the dense brush near your temporary camp. You scan the dry ground for any sign of food. You spot a tall patch of wild wheat growing near a rocky outcrop. The golden stalks sway gently in the afternoon breeze, carrying the quiet promise of a full stomach for your family tonight. You reach out your calloused hand to grasp the food. You gently strip the rough grains from the thin, fragile stem. Why do some grains fall away to the dirt before you can even catch them in your palm? This is the brilliant and frustrating natural way of wild things. Wild plants desperately want to spread their own offspring across the earth. They drop their seeds easily to the wind to ensure their continued survival in a harsh environment. They shatter and fall apart at the very slightest touch of your human hand. You only manage to gather the seeds that stubbornly cling to the living stalk, leaving the rest behind in the dust. You carry these incredibly tough, clinging seeds back to your temporary camp near the lake. You accidentally drop a few scattered grains along the well-worn dirt path. Are you slowly changing the genetic makeup of this entire plant species without even knowing it? Yes, you are doing exactly that. You process the gathered grain near the warmth of your crackling fire. You grind it down into a rough powder with a heavy, flat stone. Some of the raw grain inevitably spills into the nutrient-rich soil of your human trash pile. You do not realize that your rotting garbage is a perfect, nitrogen-rich fertilizer for wild plants. The discarded bones, the ash from your fires, and your bodily waste create an incredibly rich microenvironment. Next year you will return to this exact same campsite as you follow the seasonal migration loop. You will find a dense, thriving patch of wheat growing right where you left your waste months ago. It feels like a magical, unexplainable gift from the generous earth. How could you possibly know that you are the one who accidentally planted it? You do not know the biological truth. You do not understand the complex science of germination or soil chemistry. You just know this particular spot near your old fire pit is incredibly lucky. You start returning to this specific campsite much more often. You actively clear the competing, useless weeds away from your lucky patch of wild grass. You desperately want this specific, life-saving food source to thrive without competition. You pull up the thistles and the deep-rooted shrubs. You are managing the wild landscape without actually farming it, creating small pockets of artificial abundance. You are fiercely protecting your most reliable food source from the harsh wilderness. What happens when everyone in your growing tribe starts doing this at the exact same time? The world begins to slowly shift beneath your feet. You are spending significantly less time walking across the open plains. You are spending much more time tending to these lucky patches of wild food near your camp. You begin to build heavier, more permanent shelters made of stone and heavy timber near these reliable food sources. Your nomadic tents are replaced by solid walls that keep the wind and predators away. You start storing the excess grain in stone-lined pits dug deep into the earth. You are slowly but surely tethering yourself to a single patch of dirt. You do not realize that you are gradually trading your ancient freedom for an illusion of security. Are you domesticating the wild plants, or are the wild plants secretly domesticating you? The plants are binding you to the soil. They demand your constant presence and your unending labor. If you leave, the wild animals will eat your stored harvest. If you leave, the fast-growing weeds will choke out your precious grain. You have to stay and guard the territory. You have to defend your lucky patches from neighboring tribes who are also starving. The concept of personal property is being born in your mind. The open, shared world of your ancestors is slowly being carved into invisible, heavily guarded borders. How much pressure can your small community take before the system collapses entirely? Let us travel across the ancient world to another vital archaeological site to find the terrifying answer. You live near the muddy banks of the Euphrates River in ancient Syria. Archaeologist Gordon Hillman exhaustively studied the massive amounts of plant remains at a huge ancient settlement here called Abu Huraira. The warm climate of your childhood is suddenly getting drastically colder and much drier again. A devastating, centuries-long climate event called the Younger Dryas hits your fragile world incredibly hard. The temperatures plummet globally, locking fresh water into expanding glaciers. The wild foods are dying off in the freezing, relentless drought. You have to work so much harder just to keep your children alive. You start heavily watering the wild patches of grain that are struggling to survive. Why are you working so incredibly hard for a plant that used to grow entirely for free? You do it because you are completely and utterly trapped. Your local population has grown far too large during the previous good years of warmth and rain. You cannot simply pack up your belongings, walk away, and hunt wild game anymore. There are too many hungry mouths to feed in your densely packed, permanent village. The elderly and the very young cannot make a long, desperate journey across a dying landscape. You must protect the wild stands of grain from the encroaching desert sands at all costs. You carry heavy animal skin bags of water from the freezing river day after day. You pour the precious water over the wild, thirsty dirt just to keep the plants alive. You are investing massive amounts of your own physical energy into the ground beneath your feet. When you invest this much bodily energy into a single place, you cannot ever leave it behind. What is this heavy, relentless labor actually doing to your prehistoric body? It is absolutely destroying your bones and your joints. You kneel in the harsh dirt for 10 exhausting hours a single day. You use a heavy stone sickle to furiously cut the tough, unyielding stalks of grain. You grind the tough grain on a massive stone quern until your shoulders and elbows scream in pure agony. The biological anthropologist Thea Mollison studied the human skeletons at Abu Huraira and found horrifying evidence of this ancient suffering. Your modern skeleton would show the deep, unnatural grooves of this endless, repetitive labor. Your knees are completely worn down to the bone from kneeling on the hard earth without any padding. Your big toes are permanently deformed and enlarged from pushing off the ground while you grind the flour hour after hour. Your lower spine is fused and arthritic from the terrible burden of carrying heavy loads of grain and water. Your teeth are beginning to rot and fall out from the massive increase in processed carbohydrates and the coarse sand mixed into your daily food. Was this brutal new lifestyle really an upgrade from the freedom of hunting and gathering? It was a total biological catastrophe for your species. You suffer from entirely new, devastating diseases that your ancestors never knew. You live in incredibly close, unsanitary proximity to your own accumulating waste and your newly captured livestock. The viruses from the animals cross over into your vulnerable human population. You suffer from chronic, crippling malnutrition because your once diverse diet has shrunk to just a few types of starchy grain. You lack the essential vitamins and minerals that came from eating wild berries, nuts, and fresh meat. The anthropologist Richard Lee studied modern hunter-gatherers like the Jew/Hoansi in the Kalahari, proving that foragers only worked a few hours a day to secure highly nutritious food. Your hunter-gatherer ancestors were tall, strong, incredibly robust, and enjoyed massive amounts of leisure time telling stories around the fire. You are noticeably shorter, plagued by endless painful cavities, and constantly sick from crowded living conditions. You work significantly longer, more punishing hours than your ancestors ever did in the wild. You are constantly terrified of a single bad drought ruining your only food source and starving your entire village to death. Why did you trade your healthy, roaming freedom for this miserable, backbreaking security? You traded it because you simply did not have a choice anymore. You fell headfirst into an invisible, irreversible evolutionary trap. You fundamentally changed the wild plants by selectively gathering only the toughest stalks that held onto their seeds. The plants rapidly evolved to rely entirely on your physical labor for their own biological reproduction. The wheat completely lost its natural ability to spread its own seeds in the wind without your help. The grain physically cannot survive, sprout, or grow without your backbreaking labor to harvest, thresh, and spread it manually. You have created a mutant species that needs you just as much as you need it. You are no longer the master of your environment. You are now a biological slave to a giant, demanding grass. How did this exact same terrifying process happen on the other side of the world? Meanwhile, across the vast ancient world, a completely different story unfolds in the deep jungle. You are living in a dense, sweating, incredibly loud tropical forest in South America. The air is thick with humidity and the constant buzzing of insects. Archaeologist Dolores Paperno studied microscopic plant stones called phytoliths in Ecuador and Panama to uncover this hidden, fascinating truth. You are surrounded by incredibly thick, vibrant green vegetation that hides thousands of different edible and toxic species. You find a wild squash vine growing high up in the damp, shaded canopy. The raw flesh of this wild squash is incredibly bitter to the human tongue. The wild flesh is highly toxic and will make you violently, dangerously ill if you consume it. Why would you ever expend the precious energy to bring this poisonous plant back to your family camp? You do not want to eat the bitter, toxic flesh at all. You want the highly nutritious, calorie-dense seeds hiding safely inside the hard shell. You smash the hard shell open with a heavy rock to scrape out the rich, fatty seeds that sustain you during long hunts. You also desperately want to use the dried, hollow, waterproof gourds as lightweight containers for carrying river water back to your dwelling. You bring dozens of these wild, tough gourds back to your messy forest clearing every single season. You casually drop the bitter, toxic flesh into your growing, rotting trash heap at the edge of the camp. The seeds spill out from the discarded rinds into the dark, human waste and ash. The The seeds immediately begin to sprout and thrive in the warm, nitrogen-rich soil of your massive garbage dump. Are you an ancient agricultural genius, or are you just a remarkably messy eater? You are just a wonderfully messy human being trying to survive the jungle. You are accidentally domesticating wild, toxic plants entirely within your own garbage pile without a single thought of the future. Over hundreds of human generations, your ancestors unconsciously keep bringing the absolute largest, thickest gourds back to the camp. The plants growing in the human trash heaps slowly adapt to the incredibly rich soil and the constant, unintentional human attention. The dangerous flesh becomes slightly less bitter and toxic over thousands of years of accidental selection by hungry people. The seeds become noticeably larger, far more abundant, and much easier to extract and eat safely. You are definitely not genetically engineering this complex plant with any conscious, forward-thinking thought. You are simply living your messy, noisy, daily life, and the wild plants are aggressively adapting to your predictable habits. When does this purely accidental relationship finally become a conscious, intentional farm? It takes thousands of agonizing, confusing years for the human brain to finally understand the connection. Endless generations of your ancestors live and die without ever once realizing they are actually farmers altering the course of the planet. They simply view themselves as very active, very smart foragers who take exceptionally good care of their favorite wild spots in the forest. The radical concept of intentionally burying a perfectly good seed to create a hypothetical future plant requires a massive psychological leap. It requires you to completely delay your immediate, desperate gratification for a distant, highly uncertain future reward. You have to take perfectly good, edible, life-saving food and literally bury it in the dark, cold dirt while your children cry for dinner. What kind of starving, rational ancient human would ever voluntarily throw away their only immediate food source? Only a desperate human who has developed an absolute, unshakable faith in the changing seasons would take that massive, terrifying risk. You have watched the wild patches naturally grow from your rich trash heaps for generations, observing the cycle of death and rebirth. You suddenly connect the physical action of the falling seed to the miraculous green shoot of the coming spring. You take a precious handful of the absolute largest, toughest grains you have carefully saved all through the freezing winter. You deliberately do not eat them, even though your stomach aches with a deep, consuming hunger that keeps you awake at night. You press them firmly into the soft, wet mud near the rising, flooding river and hope the rains will come. You wait patiently for the warm sun and the heavy rain to do their ancient, invisible work beneath the soil while you pray to the sky. You have finally crossed the invisible, irreversible line from a wandering forager to an anchored farmer. What have you truly unleashed upon the entire future of the human world? You have accidentally unleashed the modern human condition in all its beautiful and terrible complexity. The very fabric of human existence is permanently altered by your simple, desperate choice to plant a seed. Populations explode rapidly because the land can now support thousands of people living side by side in crowded, filthy cities. Social hierarchies emerge immediately because someone has to guard the massive silos of stored grain from thieves and invaders. Kings and armies are born entirely from the need to protect the agricultural surplus that you created with your bare, bleeding hands. The endless, open horizon of the hunter-gatherer is replaced by walls, borders, taxation, and grueling, repetitive labor. You traded the chaotic freedom of the wild for the predictable, crushing machinery of civilization. How often do you think about the ancient bones buried beneath your modern cities? Look at your daily life today in the fast, modern world around you. You are strictly bound to tight, unrelenting schedules that dictate when you wake, when you eat, and when you sleep. You are firmly bound to specific geographic locations, paying mortgages and rent for a tiny patch of the earth that you claim as your own. You are living the direct, unbroken, echoing legacy of that ancient, accidental trap sprung by wild grass in the forgotten past. The wild, roaming foragers of the past had the absolute, undeniable freedom to simply walk away from a bad situation or a ruined landscape. You have guaranteed massive caloric security, but you pay for it with endless daily labor, bad posture, and the stress of a permanent life. You look at your dinner plate today, but you take your absolute control over nature completely for granted.